Well, good afternoon and welcome, a very warm welcome. My name is Una Chaudhuri. I teach in the departments of English, Drama and Environmental Studies here at NYU. And it's a great pleasure and privilege to welcome you all here on behalf of my colleagues in the Animal Studies Initiative. I want to start actually by telling you a little bit about the Animal Studies Initiative. The Animal Studies Initiative was established in 2010 with the goal of promoting and supporting research and teaching in this new multidisciplinary emerging field of animal studies, a rapidly growing academic area that's now represented by a number of journals, several book series from prestigious university presses, many special issues of journals, and I'd say hundreds of conferences and art exhibitions around the world. Since our inception, we've offered undergraduate minor in animal studies, which has been very popular. Besides offering a range of courses, that minor also draws from the curricula of many NYU departments, reflecting the growing interest and presence of this work across disciplines and across schools, including our professional schools. The Animal Studies Initiative also organizes annual public events like this one and provides funding for graduate student research. And we will soon be launching a book series with NYU Press. Last year, we proposed and were approved to offer a new Master's in Animal Studies. And in the fall of 2018, NYU will be offering one of the first Masters in Animal Studies in the United States. We're in fact already offering some courses that will count towards that Master's retroactively, including the course, the graduate course I'm teaching this term with UNULA. So with the Masters, of course, as befits this field, the program will be broadly multidisciplinary, offering curricula ranging over and among philosophy, history, literature, politics, sociology, anthropology, theater, cinema, and visual arts, among others. Also very happy to say and to welcome 2 new faculty members in the Animal Studies Initiative this semester. Jeff Sebo, I don't see Jeff here, but I know he'll be here very soon. Oh, he's teaching. Jeff is actually returning to us, having originally been, I think, our first faculty fellow, postdoctoral faculty fellow. And we also have Nandini Thiyagarajan with us, who is this year's new faculty fellow in animal studies. So welcome, Nandini, and Jeff when he comes back. So as always, there are many people to thank who helped make today's event possible. First of all, Gwyneth Malin, Director of NYU Center for the Humanities, where we are. And great thanks to her for giving us this space and helping with all the arrangements for it. Also, Uli Baer, the Faculty Director of NYU Center for the Humanities. Caroline Oss, the Media and Communications Coordinator, who's done so much to help with the program here. Denny Valentin, the Administrative Aide in Center for Humanities. I'd also like to thank all the colleagues and programs that have co-sponsored this event. One is the Environmental Humanities Series, which comes out of the Center for Humanities, and the co-founder of that is Yanula Athanasakis, one of our animal studies faculty as well. So thank you, Yanula, for your co-sponsorship. Also the Department of English and the program in creative writing, and especially want to thank Deborah Landau and Joanna Yass for their help. I, of course, want to thank all my colleagues in environmental studies and animal studies, especially Jennifer Jackett, Colin Jeromack, who's also the chair of environmental studies, and Dame Nandini Thiyagarajan. Most of all, I'd like to thank Mari Roberts, our administrator, who dealt with all the logistics and made it possible for us to bring some of our guests here in a fairly comfortable and seamless fashion. So, today's event is, it actually marks the 6th anniversary, almost to the day, of the first public event that was held for the Animal Studies Initiative. That was back in, on October 14, 2011. I know some of you were here then. And I also had the pleasure of organizing that one. The title of that event was Animal Studies, Changing the Subject. And that title was an intentional pun, because we wanted to talk, of course, about the fact, acknowledge the fact that animal studies vastly expands the subject matter of the humanities and social sciences. It changes the subject in that way. But we also had the further ambition to signal that serious attention to the subject of animals is also a way to rethink the subject in the sense of the self, or subjectivity, or notions of identity, agency, subjecthood. So it was right from the beginning, it was part of our goal to approach this possibility in the most ambitious and expansive philosophical way, and to think about animal studies not just as a critique of speciesism, which is a set of practices, but also as an inquiry into the roots and consequences of anthropocentrism, which is a whole paradigm, an ideological paradigm. The title of today's symposium is Writing Animals, and that's another pun, or that's offered, I'm offering that as another pun, because of course we're talking about the many genres that are used to address animals in language, in writing. We've got 3 of those genres, 3 ways of writing about animals are featured on our panel. Fiction with Karen Joy Fowler, journalism with Andy Newman, and what I think of as public science writing. Maybe Alexandra will give us, I mean, I say that with great admiration as a genre and a goal. So those are 3 of many possible genres with which one can approach the challenge of writing about animals. And so that's one meaning, but we also, of course, mean it to signal the fact that when we do take animals seriously in writing, we wind up changing the whole activity of using language, of writing, and we become aware of ourselves in a new way as writing animals, animals who write. We humans are animals who write, and our encounter with the animal subject expands that dimension of our identity as animals who write. It's, I think, one of the ways that it's one of many ways that the animal is a source of self-understanding for the human. It's one of the ways that we realize that animals make us who we are, remind us of who we are, help us better understand and get a handle on who we are. But also that animals are a subject that brings us sort of face to face with our limitations. And I want to talk about actually a quote from Alexandra's. I have it in here, wrong place to have it. Sorry, bear with me. I was going to print this out, but I'm doing multimedia here. Alexandra's wonderful book about smell, into the world of dogs with smell. And in the final chapter of that book, and if you haven't read that book, you have such a treat ahead of you, not only for dog lovers, but just for everybody. that final chapter where Alexandra expands to talk about how this has changed her relationship to the world. And she says, the great pleasure in having spent the last years thinking about smelling is that my world has changed color. It smells. Well, it has always smelled, just as the light bouncing amidst the reds and greens of our palette are the unnoticed ultraviolets and infrareds that the honeybee and pit snake attend to. But I have not bothered to open my mind to the smells. And then she goes on to describe the ways that she now does that. But now I'm smelling all over the place. I put my nose to things without fear and with interest. I smell the skunkiness of bitter coffee beans swirled into ice cream, the loamy smell of the park after rain. I smell when the previous occupant of our building's elevator has opened a new glossy magazine as she rode home. I smell someone's sudden urge to clean his hands with a sanitizing wipe while on the bus. And that's a long chapter in which we get so many wonderful accounts of that kind. And then she ends by saying, today, as I will do tomorrow and the next tomorrow, I head out the door with both my dogs. I watch their idle sniffs, their exploratory sniffs, their communicative sniffs, their pushy sniffs. When my dogs poke their nose in the earth, I pause to let them. I feel a frisson of excitement, both from knowing some of what is happening and from the realization that I will never really know what is happening. I will never smell as a dog smells. I accept it. It's a dog's difference I celebrate. And this way of smelling, their very noses are different. Quiet distillers of a world that we have stood up from and forgotten. It's a wonderful last line. But you know, that experience of recognizing, thanks, JJ, of recognizing a whole new world that's made possible by the serious encounter with the animal, and at the same time recognizing the human limits that encounter clarifies. I think another great example of the richness and complexity of the human-animal relation as we're beginning to discover it in our field is in Karen J. Fowler, the title of Karen J. Fowler's wonderful, wonderful novel, We Are Completely Besides Ourselves. There are many ways to interpret that funny, whimsical, enigmatic title, but one of them is this sense that there is a whole world of knowledge and experience very close to us that we have perhaps disavowed, that we are standing besides rather than within, and that animal studies opens a pathway to entering that world. So with all that, I'm just so delighted we're going to have the opportunity to explore these ideas further with this wonderful group of people. And to introduce them individually, here's my new colleague, Nandini Thiyagarajan. And then once Nandini has done the introductions, we will launch into individual remarks, brief remarks by the speakers, followed by questions from some of us, and then a conversation with all of you. Thank you. Welcome.
Animals weave themselves into our lives and stories, from passing encounters, comparisons that assert species boundaries, and analogies written on animal bodies, to robust characters who arrive with their own histories, lives, and stories in tow. Animals live and die within and alongside human stories. Can you hear me? Louder?
A little louder.
Is that better?
Use the mic.
Good? Yeah? Okay. Okay. They creep, slither, fly, bound, and gallop to gather at the edges of the stories we tell. Some people, like Karen Joy Fowler, Alexandra Horowitz, and Andy Newman, have recognized the richness within the presences and lives of animals and responded by turning careful, compassionate, and painstaking attention towards them. Our speakers today have responded to the questions that animals pose, not with easy answers or concrete understandings of animal lives or human and animal relationships, Rather, their work turns us toward the messy entanglements of our lives, the vast and complicated kinds of human-animal kinships that move towards love as quickly as they can veer towards violence, and, perhaps most importantly, in their own way, each writer here welcomes and thinks closely about the multiple ways in which animals confound us. By demonstrating through their work and writing what it looks like to be changed, moved, and shaken by animal presences in our lives, Fowler, Horowitz, and Newman inspire us to consider how animals have changed us and work through what reciprocity towards animals might look like. During my own academic career, I have encountered each of our speakers' work by recommendation and by chance. I am endlessly inspired by their deliberate, uncompromising, and brave attention to the lives of animals who we most often overlook, and it is an honor for me to introduce them to you today. Karen Joy Fowler is the author of 3 story collections and 6 novels, including We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves, which not only is one of the most amazing literary engagements with animals and human-animal kinship, but it was also shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize of the first year that prize was open to Americans. It won the PEN/Faulkner Award as well as the California Book Award for Fiction in 2013. She's also the author of the Jane Austen Book Club, which was on the New York Times bestseller list for 19 weeks and was made into a major motion picture. In addition, her novel Sister Noon was a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award. Consistently acclaimed by critics, most of her titles have been New York Times notable books and named to many best of the year lists. Born and raised in an academic family in Bloomington, Indiana, she holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in South Asian Studies from the University of California, Berkeley. She lived for many years in Davis, California, and now lives in Santa Cruz. Alexandra Horowitz is the author of Being a Dog, Following the Dog into a World of Smell, Inside of a Dog, What Dogs See, Smell, and Know, and On Looking, 11 Walks with Expert Eyes. She has worked at Barnard College, Columbia University since 2004, where she teaches, amongst other courses, seminars on canine cognition and creative nonfiction writing. In 2008, inspired by her students, she began the Horowitz Dog Cognition Lab, where she continues her research on dog cognition and pursues her keen and ongoing interest in trying to understand what it might be like to be a dog from several different perspectives. Horowitz has long been interested in understanding the Umwelt of another animal, and her research and writing is aimed to answer the question of what it's like to be a dog. Whether she is writing about dogs, saving fledgling birds, or fish traffic engagement, Horowitz boldly refuses to take common understandings of animals, whether scientific or cultural, as a given fact. Last but not least, Andy Newman has covered New York City and the vicinity for the New York Times since 1997. He is the founding reporter of the Pet City and New York Today columns and ran the Times' popular City Room blog. He has covered an impressive array of stories, from the wars between ice cream vendors and why people gaze out of their apartment windows, to the actual secret lives of pets, a rat named Rosie who became a Broadway star, and the ASPCA's neonatal kitten facilities. With his wife and daughter, he has raised 2 orphaned pigeons in his bathroom, and his dog is an extremely minor Instagram star. His stories capture how animals live alongside us in all of their humor, absurdity, seriousness, and compassion that they can encompass. So please welcome me in join me in welcoming all of our speakers.
We haven't decided what order we go in, but do you have a preference, or we could just go down the line here? Alexandra?
That starts with me then.
Yes.
Excellent.
I think I'll sit, if that's all right. Thank you very much for having me today. It's a real delight, and it's lovely to be on a panel with the 2 of you. You asked me to think about what animals have done in my journey as a writer, and I reflected on that a little bit, and I realized I probably wouldn't be a writer without animals. literally, I am a scientist of animals, and it was only because of the obviousness of the fact that the science should be and seem to be relevant to dog owners, since I study dog cognition and the mind of dogs, that I decided to write about it. This was a happy circumstance because once I started writing about dogs, dogs changed my way of seeing, much more really than being a scientist of dogs. But ruminating on dogs and getting feedback to my writing about dogs changed my writing profoundly. So for instance, not only do I write about dogs, but one of my books is about bringing attention, new attention to familiar scene. And I began this really by walking around the block, and that might sound familiar, with my dog, you know, and trying to see what my dog saw that I did not, or in many cases smelled that I did not experience. And I thought the challenge of translating the dog's world to my own understanding was sufficient that maybe I could actually get other human walkers around that block to communicate their perspectives and what they see in a block which I've stopped seeing, which I sleepwalk through. So some of my writing was directly inspired by a kind of ruminative investigation into the dog's world. And indeed, I wrote a book about taking walks with 11 other people with diverse backgrounds, geologist, artist, a woman who was blind, a sound engineer, a child, and so forth, to try to see that block anew, bring new attention to it with their perspectives in mind. What comes up most when I think about writing about dogs is the surprising results of having written about dogs. They are various. One is that I now have thousands of pictures of dogs, and this is because correspondents write to me to inquire about the book or about a question about dogs, and they inevitably include a picture of their dog. And when I got the first few pictures, now 8 years ago, I thought that was sweet, and now I do have numbering in the thousands. And it's a glorious representation of how people interact with literature, in this case nonfiction literature, that they find it directly and immediately relevant and applicable to their life and want to share their dog with me. Other ways in which I was surprised about writing about dogs include that the public seems to want omniscience from a scientist of animals. So a lot of what I express in Inside of a Dog and also in Being a Dog has to do with the limitations of the science of dog cognition's understanding of dogs, and also maybe of a human understanding of a non-human, and the pleasures somewhat in that, as in the excerpt that you read, marking it and noting it and not being frustrated by the fact that we are literally agnostic about a non-human animal. I embrace that more. My readers embrace that less. They want inevitably to know about their dog. So there will not be a presentation where I don't have a question about I call them my dog questions. And in my canine cognition class, I have to explicitly forbid my dog questions until the very end of the semester, or we would just be talking about people's dogs, which may be interesting, but another class. So why does my dog roll in feces? Why does my dog circle around 3 times before he lies down? Why does my dog hump my leg? You know, why does my dog circle around 3 times before he humps my leg? You know, and in so many cases, my answer is that scientists haven't really addressed that question, or we really don't know. You know, I could give possible answers, but it's okay too that we don't have the answer. I'm interested that you formulate the question, but we can't answer it. Relatedly, writing about dogs is a kind of double-edged sword. So I think having a dog on a cover of a book is a way to open the door. And people will pick up that book, and I'm lucky that I write about a topic where people will inevitably pick up that book and open it, and then I'm in their living room like that. On the other hand, there are certain expectations that people have about a dog book which mine will inevitably fail to live up to. One is that it is a dog book, and by which I mean it might be a good-natured book with stories about dogs, all the wonderful things there are about dogs, or cute pictures about dogs. And it really is none of those things. I'm really asking dogs, I might be asking dogs as well, but I'm asking people as they open the book to engage with dogs as a topic of, as a subject of inquiry, as a topic of science, to engage with the scientific process and what it's like to ask questions, ask and answer questions about the minds of a non-human animal. And so I think I get, there's some frustration that having picked up that dog book, the answers are not all within, and it's not all good-natured dog stories. And I'd love that if that territory of just exploration and not knowing could be expanded. Another thing that has happened is that writing about dogs has changed my science very much. So in spending the time to think about the world of dogs and hearing what people say and are interested in about dogs, I've changed many times the questions that I am looking at empirically. So from beginning with looking at, my first research questions were about why a dog, if a non-human animal like a dog might have a theory of mind, think about others' thoughts. That's how I got into studying dogs, not dogs qua dogs. And then I had a long series of studies which were about the anthropomorphisms we make of dogs. You know, why that we think dogs feel guilty. Why do we find some dogs cute and not other dogs? Do we think that if a dog wants your attention, that they're jealous, that they have the secondary emotions that we do? And playing with the way we interact with dogs, which is something that I don't think I would have gotten into. Science begets more science. We start with the questions that have been asked before, and we follow those same approaches, more or less. Interacting through writing with the subject, it really changed how I do my science profoundly and continues to. I think I could also say that writing about animals has let me deduct all my animal-related literature from my taxes. That's also been a nice surprise because that is most of my library. But finally, I will say that I couldn't have picked a better topic. There is a joyousness for me in thinking about animals, in their limitations, in the sadnesses. And part of that is that I cannot capture it verbally, that they aren't telling us what they think, and that we have to create and invent ways of trying to understand them nonetheless. Thanks.
How's the sound level in the back there? Am I okay? I am currently a grandmother of 7 children. And because of this, I'm having a return to reading aloud from children's books. And noticing again, as I perhaps noticed before when I was reading to my children and perhaps did not, just how many children's books have animal protagonists. But more than not, I would say. But of course, they're not really animals because they wear pajamas and they brush their teeth and they kiss their parents goodnight. And it's one of the things it's made me think about is the very, very complicated terrain we expect children to traverse with regard to animals. That, you know, on the one hand, you're watching chicken run and, you know, eating the chicken McNuggets as you do so. It's just, it's all I would think, if you stopped and thought about it at all, which most children, fortunately or unfortunately do not, it would seem very, very confusing. In my case, I think there was an additional area of confusion in that my father was a psychologist. He worked at Indiana University. He was a Skinnerian back in the days when that was still kind of new and exciting. And he studied learning by running rats through mazes. And so as a child, I spent a fair bit of time in the rat lab, which seemed in many ways to be a happy sort of place, at least, you know, from a child's eye point of view. The rats appeared healthy, they were very inquisitive, obviously they were very, very smart. My father was studying some of the ways in which they were very, very smart. And so, you know, so I had a lot of contact with the rats in the lab. I was, in fact, allowed to open any cage at any time and pull a rat out and talk to it for as long as I cared to. No doubt wreaking havoc with the data, but nevertheless. Sometimes a rat would wash out in some way of the learning program, and that rat would usually come home and then become part of the family. So a sort of instant upgrade in terms of the attention that this animal now got. Veterinarians called in if there was a sniffle in a way that I imagine the lab rats would not have enjoyed that same attention. But also, in a horrific incident in my childhood, one of the neighbors put out rat poisoning to prevent wild rats from coming into the house, killed several of the neighborhood cats as well as my dog with the rat poison. So there was just, you know, all the same animal, but occupying very different spaces in my life and in my mind. I think that I started to argue with my father about whether animals could think or not when I was about 6 years old, possibly earlier. This was, of course, my father's area of expertise, so another kind of child might have thought her father had something interesting to say on the subject, but I was not that sort of child. I was very confident in my belief that the animals in our household, and there were a great many of them, birds, snakes, hamsters, dogs and cats, I was very confident that at least with the dogs and cats, that what I was observing looked to me like thought. And now, with apologies to Alexandra, I'm going to tell one of my dog stories. We had a collie when I was very little, who was tremendously protective of me and my big brother, and would not allow our parents to spank us, and would not allow us to cross the street. Just kept a very, very careful eye on us, and got between us and the street if it looked like we were even thinking of heading in that direction. My brother is 4 years older than me, so at a certain point, she suddenly stopped where he was concerned. She suddenly allowed my older brother to cross the street, and she still would not allow me to. And then I grew a little older, and she eventually, the day came when I too was allowed to cross the street. Now, I don't really know how to explain this behavior. When I told my father, I thought it represented thinking. As far as he would go was that it was interesting. It was interesting behavior, he thought. But of course, by asserting that the dog had some sort of plan or intent, or was modifying the behavior in response to our growing up, was a sort of anthropomorphism that he could not abide, could not tolerate. So in many ways, I think of We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves as a book I started when I was 6 years old. I am still obsessed with animal cognition and what we can know about it and what we can never know about it and how we go about trying to answer questions and all the sort of sad history of lab animals and in many ways very unwieldy and unkind ways that we went about trying to determine what non-human animals were up to. In the rat lab, there was a part of the lab that I was not allowed to go into, and that was where the monkeys were. The rats, I could maybe fool myself at 5 into thinking that they were leading happy, healthy, adventurous lives in the mazes with their cheeses. But there was no way, even at 5, to think that about the monkeys. There were 2 rhesus monkeys. They were kept in cages beside each other, but not so close that they could touch each other. They had pulled their hair out. They had so clearly been tormented beyond what they were capable of dealing with. And I don't know what was done to them. I will never know. I do not really want to know, but I think that I have been haunted by those 2 rhesus monkeys my entire life, and that too is what prompted me to write We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves. I, as part of writing the book, sat in on an animal theory class at UC Santa Cruz and looked at what was happening in the fields of animal cognition, covering a great many species. It was just the most fascinating class. It seems to me to be a very fast-moving field at the moment. And I guess my takeaway was that we have just underestimated the other creatures that we share the planet with at every possible turn and in every possible way. And that the limitation really is ours, that the more human-like an animal's intelligence is, the more we are capable of seeing it as intelligence. And if it is not as human-like, then the limitation is ours, not to understand it also as intelligence. And I will stop there.
Some media, please.
Hello. Look at that, it works. So my name's Andy. I have been a local news reporter for the Times for about 20 years, during which time I've written many, many stories about animals, not just cats and dogs, and deer and wild turkeys, but strange animals like the runaway zebra of Staten Island, and probably the only obituary of a rhinoceros that ever ran in the Times. I also once had the honor of asking Dr. Horowitz why dogs like to pee on trash cans. I also once walked around the block also with my dog for the entire length of the marathon, 75 times, although the dog did not make it all the way around. One of the most striking things for me in writing about animals, and this is obviously a theme that comes up again and again with everyone here, is that, I mean, it's one thing when you're writing as a scientist, but when you're just writing as a reporter for the local news section of the paper, whenever you think you're writing about animals, you end up always writing about animals through the eyes or the distorted lens of people.
Just one second. Are you having trouble with the sound?
Is it that I'm trying to, am I getting closer and further? Okay. Is this better? Okay. It's just the fact that it always is going to come down to people's views on animals more than the animals themselves. And I wanted to start right here at NYU with the hawk cam, which some of you may remember in 2011. Some hawks built a nest outside the president's office, and he was kind enough to, is that right? On the 12th floor, and he was kind enough to let us put a.
You have to talk so we can't.
How's this? No, that's too much. That's because I keep looking away to look at the. So they let us put a webcam up on the side of the building to show people what these hawks were doing, and we thought, here we are presenting unmediated, nature in itself, but most of the conversation that was generated by this was people kind of projecting their own interests and conflicts onto these animals, and what the mother wanted and what she didn't want. The mother hawk, Violet, eventually got something. She had a band on her leg, and something got caught, and her leg started to swell up, and there became this health crisis, and people were screaming at NYU, you must, you have to rescue this hawk, and the state gets involved, and it says, no, she'll knock the nest over if you try to catch her. And then finally, they decided to leave her alone, and then eventually she went down into the park and was captured, and they did the operation to cut off her foot so that she could kind of get rid of that thing, and she died. And then people were like, why did you let that happen? The same people who had been kind of complaining that there was no intervention going on, as soon as there is intervention and something goes wrong, they're kind of like, upset about that. A very similar thing happened a few years later. Last year there was the Harlem deer, which was this, not an advertisement, but a deer that was running around in a park in Harlem, which was fine until he got out and then went into a housing project courtyard, and the police captured him, and at that point he became this kind of pawn in a fight between the city and, I'm going to get rid of that because it's not showing it, in a pawn between a fight between the city, between the mayor and the governor, who hate each other, and the city was saying, well, now we have this deer, we've captured him, we have to euthanize him, there's no place to put him. And the state went against its guidelines and said, no, you have to release the deer, and everybody's screaming at both parties. And then finally the state says, we're going to come get the deer and release him. And by the time they got there, the deer had died. And once again, people were kind of upset. Excuse me. So there was people over and over again would kind of make presumptions about what these animals really want and what's good for them, based not really on any particular knowledge, but just sort of on their fantasy of what the animal was about. And that's just something that kept coming up over and over again. So that's one kind of story, these conflict stories where people kind of use animals to play out conflicts between each other. And then last year my editor said, hey, we're going to start a column about pets. We want you to write it. And so that kind of led me into a very different territory where people's attitudes about their pets suddenly became much more obvious to me. We have these animals, we kind of invent personas for them. And we think we are telling each other what's going on with the animals, but we don't really, of course, necessarily understand it. So the first thing I set out to do, or one of the first things when I was writing this column, was just to try to observe the life of a cat and write about what he did. And this turned out to be one of the most difficult stories I've ever reported. This is Petro, who lived on his block in Carroll Gardens and was constantly running around and sniffing people and sort of was the boss of the block. And so I was like, great, I'll just go watch this cat, take notes for a few minutes and write a story about that. It turns out it's much harder to observe a cat without influencing what the cat does than you would think. He also didn't keep regular hours, even though people said he was constantly there. So I would be literally staking out his block for half a day, waiting for Petro to show up, and then he would maybe come out for a minute and then like hide behind something, or he would come out and then I would kind of very, very, very slowly cross the street and try to find him, try to engage with him, and he would run away. So that whole line of reporting, that I thought this is going to be the future of Pet City, my column, where I just kind of like write about the lives of animals, proved so difficult that I basically got one story out of it, and that was about it. So then I did more kind of traditional stories. That some of them were very cute stories, some of them were sad stories where the pets died, but they all had the kind of story arc that I knew was more about the people than about the pets and the people's experience about the pets. And eventually I got very interested in these people who took the whole idea of creating personas for their pets to an extreme. And these are the Instagram dog people, who are some of the strangest characters I've ever run across as a reporter. These are people who basically would create a persona for their animal that was designed to maximize the commercial interest of that animal, and then they could sell ads against it. There was one guy who was able to quit his day job and just be, the wrangler for his Instagram celebrity dog. And it was at that point that I sort of crossed that line, which they always used to not tell us to cross, where we get involved in the story. But nowadays we're encouraged to cross because we're told that the reader really wants to feel like they're making a connection with a real person, so we're supposed to insert ourselves into the stories a lot more. So we ourselves kind of create personas of who we are to speak to the reader. So the persona of Andy, the Pet City guy, was working on a story about Instagram dogs and thought, hey, what if I tried to make my dog an Instagram dog? Which was sort of a non-starter because my dog, Barnaby, is the worst possible candidate, unlike these dogs, which are just love to pose and kind of will stay still for a very long time and play with whatever cute props that you give them. Barnaby absolutely refuses to do anything other than what you want him. He's an elderly basset hound. He mostly kind of wants to eat trash and poop on the floor and pee on the floor and just basically live this kind of very doggy life. He's not interested in, putting on funny hats or anything like that. So I thought, this is going to be how I sell Barnaby, is that he's going to be about authenticity. And I told the woman who runs the Instagram dog agency, I have this great idea. I'm going to make a niche for my dog in the marketplace. Instead of being cute and all frou-frou and always, doing picture-perfect things, he's just going to be really gross because that's what he is. And I was so proud I came up with this concept. And she was like, no. Your dog needs to have traits that people can relate to. Her dog supported charities and was into fashion and travel and all these things. At which point I realized I was not going to be able to quit my day job and become an Instagram dog mogul, which is why I'm still here. But I did get to have these moments with Barnaby where he ate trash and people liked his picture, so that was pretty good. The last story I'm going to talk about is one where I really got involved, and that was in the spring. My wife found an injured baby pigeon, and she prevailed upon me to take it into the Wild Bird Fund, which is the big rehab place in New York for baby birds, for all kinds of birds. And I was going to leave it there because the last thing I wanted, I have this thing about not wanting to rescue animals because inevitably they're going to die, or at least that was what I thought. So I brought it into the Wild Bird Fund, excuse me, and was preparing to surrender it to them, and then it occurred to me I should write a story about this. So only because it was a story, I took the pigeon home, and they gave me another pigeon. And so we ended up raising 2 pigeons ourselves. Me and my wife and my daughter fell in love with the pigeons, and eventually we brought them back, and they got released. And now when I see a pigeon in the street, I have a very different relationship to him than I did before, and I look at him and I just say, hi, and I feel like I know you, but of course I don't know them at all. Thank you.
one of the things I'm struck by with all three of you is this idea of, I don't know, the animal as a lens to the world, as something that helps one encounter the world in fresh and new ways. And I'm wondering whether any of you think of that, pushing that even further and thinking of the animal as an artistic collaborator. I mean, you talked about the fact that it was because you were walking with the dog that you were able to do a certain kind of, you said, ruminative investigation. And then these people who, use who do the Instagram work. I mean, one thinks of artists who do a version of that, like William Wegman, who do think of this as some kind of interspecies collaboration. So I'm wondering, what is the potential of that as a cultural practice that might move us out of some of these closures or some of these blind spots of the kind you were talking about, Andy, about how people project their fantasies onto animals or their expectations. Do you see, from your own experience, do you see interesting creative potential for cultural practice?
There is.
That makes sense.
Yeah, there's obviously all sorts of interesting creative potential for cultural practice, but if you're talking about sort of getting past the filters and the kind of things that we project onto animals, as long as you're curating it yourself and then presenting it to the public, you're doing some sort of distortion to it that's inevitable. So if your dog may cooperate or may not cooperate, but you're always kind of choosing what to present to people.
Yeah, I like the idea of what Andy did, which was try to celebrate with this medium the dog that you had. In other words, trying to see it for itself, really, is what it seems to me you were doing. And then this was a lens by which you could put each snapshot that you saw, into a little frame, which seems to me quite nice. So that it requires that you participate at the dog's level, which seems to me more interesting than when I first think of my default thinking about art with animal collaborators. It's art as defined by us, right? It's the elephant's painting, ostensibly, right? Which people hugely celebrate. The excitement, I guess, that a non-human animal might be doing something that we consider art, but of course turns out to be devastatingly bad, and there are people who do elaborate training of and dancing with dogs, which is sort of a fascinating training exercise, but I find it bizarre to call it a dance with the dogs, given that the way the dog's behavior has to be shaped and what the dog's participation is. It's sort of an unequal participation. So if the art is going to be considering the animal's perspective on what would be artistic or musical, then I love that idea, but I think that is very hard for us to see.
So it's collaboration if the animal can lead.
I think they would have to lead because
yeah.
we are the big we step on the feet in dancing, right? We're the ones who step forward. So I would like to see something maybe where the animal gets to be the leader.
This is a complicated question, I think, and one that I will only feel happy with my answer if I think about it for several days. But I was struck in Charles Siebert's book how much time he spends just looking at Roger, at the ape, and not fantasizing what might be going on, not finding it a kind of possibility for a kind of very rich but very blank space. And I guess that, and maybe I'm just repeating what Alexandra said, that I think if we collaborate with an animal in a way that allows the animal to lead, we cannot actually know where we get to at any, where we're going or where we get to at any point, if we do it sort of honestly.
Well, in the practices that, for example, that you describe, which is just this, room to the investigation, that really amounts to a kind of very respectful and patient observation, and allowing that space to remain open for whatever might arise, rather than leading the animal where you want it to go. I'm thinking of one of the most I think interesting recent books in animal studies is Vincent Desprez' What Would Animals Say If We Asked Them the Right Questions? And I mean, she's obviously extending that question of collaborating with animals beyond artistic collaboration. It's kind of, you had a little slip of the tongue, Alexandra, where you said, I asked the dogs, whereas you were meant to ask myself. So I guess my question is this the question, are we asking the right kinds of questions? And now here's actually a question that I got from some of my colleagues. Can we answer that question also in relationship to the kind of current or recent history of our cultural engagement with animals? Do you think it's easy, for example, is it easier to think about and write about animals today than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago? What has changed? Where are we at culturally with our relationship to animal knowledge, animal relationships, animal ethics and respect? What's your sense of where we are culturally? Again, a big question. You can just jump in anyway.
Go ahead.
I could start. I've been recently doing a little research into what it was like to live around dogs and with dogs about 200 years ago. And my overarching feeling was things are so much better for many animals today, and certainly not, on the one hand, we have huge agribusiness, and that's very bad for billions of animals. On the other hand, there is this opening where we're suddenly interested in animals for their own sake. That's different than the dog autobiographies that were very popular, right? Where very few of them seem to be, I'm not a scholar of them, but much other than a lens by which to see ourselves, another way of looking at ourselves. And now I think that a truly great dog autobiography would have to seriously, legitimately be difficult to understand. In other words, it wouldn't be recognizable prose at some level. In other words, it would, to put words in the animal's...
It would be a scratch and sniff.
Yeah. Yeah, having to render the animal in their own language is something we almost now are allowing to happen. I think that's transformative. That's very different than what I've seen historically. But that's still only for some small subset of animals that we've plucked and decided for other reasons are interesting to investigate. So the dog has gotten a lot of interest because A, we have domesticated and changed and molded them, and also B, because they are cognitively interesting in these ways that psychologists have been interested in studying cognition. But of course, also pigs, right? I mean, very similar in a lot of ways, but dogs have been let in. Chimps are let in because of their similarity with us. Big, charismatic animals are let in. Dolphins are let in because of their brains, and it's a very small group of animals that now have the possibility that we will grant them the space to kind of tell us their story. And it's not everyone here. That's my take.
There was a book called The Sound of a Wild Snail Eating. That's just a really beautiful book where a woman who's recovering from an illness just watches a snail and tries to give its full snailhood. You know.
When I was taking this class on animal theory, I came across a historical event that I'm guessing maybe many of you are aware of, but I was not, which is the brown dog riots in England in 1906 and 1907, which involved a statue that anti-vivisectionists had put up to commemorate the dogs from the Battersea shelter who were being used in medical lectures, with something on the pedestal expressing very strong feelings about how the dogs were being tormented and how the dogs were suffering. And this infuriated the medical students. So there were months of pitched battles while they tried to destroy the statue, and the police tried to protect the statue. But one of the things that struck me about it is that on the one side, in favor of vivisection, were the medical students and some scientists, and on the other side, trying to protect the statue, were the anti-vivisectionists, but also the suffragists, and also the labor movement, the unions, and also the socialists and the Fabians. And, you know, just this moment in time when you had this enormous intersection, of groups all focused on animal welfare. And then I'm not sure what happened to that coalition, but it seems to me that it vanished, and that somehow the narrative that won was the medical students' narrative, which is that sympathy for animals and concern about their welfare and even interest in their inner lives was a childish thing, and sentimental and female, and something that you outgrew in order to live a more realistic life. And that, I feel, and I hope I'm right, it is shifting. That's what I see shifting, that interest in animals and sympathy for animals now doesn't carry that childish taint that somehow managed to stick to it for decades.
Was the reason that the suffragists and the labor people got involved that they saw sort of a common thread that here was something that was denied agency and it needs to be liberated and kind of...
Yes, I think, you know, there was a hospital in the area which did not operate on the poor in the way other hospitals in the area did, which is, you know, the poor in Battersea frequently were put in a position where they had to trade medical care for being part of an experimental sort of process. And so they attached, I think, very strongly to the dogs in this way. And then the labor movement went along with them, and the suffragists were, you know, very concerned about how the horses were being treated. And so, like I said, there was just this enormous coalition and almost nobody on the other side, and yet they did not win.
Well, and you know, within animal studies now, within the academic field of animal studies, there's a great deal of attention to these kinds of intersections, you know, sort of yoked oppressions, I mean, kinds of oppression that shore each other up. So you have, you know, feminist takes on animal studies, race and animality. So that's now become a lens, a common lens within which to understand our relationship to animals within the animal studies discourse. I have a number of questions from our colleagues, but I'm sure that many people in the audience, I could see when you all were talking, that there were people ready to jump in with their questions. So why don't we open it up to the audience now for a while, and then yes, all the way back there.
Thank you so much for all your presentations. Your particular.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very interesting to hear about your practices. And my question actually is about writing, since that's how the seminar is called, Writing Animals. So I would like to ask about your particular strategies. How do you use language? And I recall the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze once writing about different ways to write animals. He said that there is a possibility of writing about animals and there is a possibility of writing in the place of animals. And for him it was a pretty important distinction, because in the case of writing in the place of animals, for him it's a very creative endeavor. That's like pushing language to its limits. And in the case of writing about animals, it's more responding to political and let's say environmental animal studies needs. So I see like you have like different goals and different purposes in your practices. So basically, could you elaborate a bit, like what writing means as a medium for each of you? And in the end, like what about other mediums? In your presentation, you used video. Like, does it really enrich writing about animals when you have image as a complement? And what does it actually add? Yeah.
And of course, Karen mentions sniff and scratch and sniff, which would be another kind of medium besides writing and language. What was who was the philosopher you mentioned?
Gilles Deleuze.
Deleuze, okay.
I think I a little bit, I try to be somewhere between about and as if, right? I don't want to take the animal's voice or pretend to take the animal's voice, but I don't want to stand too distantly. I try to kind of embody the animal with a explicit understanding that I am taking a human perspective on that animal, that that's inevitable, and I'm just making it visible all the time. I'm always reminding the reader of who we are looking at and trying to imagine the life of this other creature while still trying to translate that life and take their voice. When thinking about, so this most recent book was about smell and trying to imagine the olfactory world of a dog or any animal, what it is like to perceive primarily, fundamentally, smells as opposed to vision first, as we do. And in that case, I think having some other media would be fantastic. And I've always been very interested in, because it's all as if for me. It's, I translate all the olfactory language into language of color. It's as if my world has turned colorful. It's because we don't have a terrific expressive language for smells, and I'm not going to make it up. I don't think that makes it any better. But I do think that the translation, the scene translation, might be evocative in a way my writing is not. And I've often worked with animators, as a matter of fact, to try to picture smell. And that experience itself has affected my writing, because then I have seen things about smell that I wouldn't have seen before, and that presumably an olfactory animal is experiencing all the time. Just the way smell is moving, for instance, in just the way that the visual image is not, so that there's never really a smell moment, the way we all feel like this is a static scene until somebody moves. It's a fluid medium. But I haven't succeeded, I don't think, in drawing that picture. But I think a visual medium would help there.
Yeah, in the Pet City columns, I did get to do a lot of videos, and I felt like it was a way to kind of give the animals a little bit more agency and let them tell stories. But even then, of course, the way you're framing it and what you're shooting and the same choices that you're making as a writer. In the language itself, I always find that it's kind of like a tug of war between letting myself just use the animals as a vehicle to tell a story that I'm telling that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what the animals are thinking or experiencing at all, and trying to be more, at least transparent in the language and just describe this happened and this happened and this happened, and not try to kind of read motivation into it. But it's a very tricky, and it's like the two forces are kind of tugging against each other constantly.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask, we definitely want to hear Karen's answer to that question, but I was wondering whether that's the intention. You've expressed that so clearly as to what your intention is, what you try to do in order to honor the otherness of the other animal. But is that what the audience wants? Is that what the readers want? And in fact, do they really kind of push you for something very different? You mentioned that they want to talk about their personal experiences. But what have you found, what's most common in terms of the responses you get when you write about animals from your readership, in terms of what they're hankering for?
I mean, was that directed at me? So I believe that the Pet City column that got the most traffic, which is at least one measure that we use, was one about this woman who had a dog, and there was a homeless guy who lived on the street outside her building, and she gradually made friends with him, and then she would let him walk her dog, and this guy became very, very close to the dog, and years go by, the guy's no longer homeless, and the dog gets very old and has cancer and is dying. And I was allowed to be in the room when the guy kind of came to say goodbye to the dog. And so that was a story that was so much about the human experience of the animal and the connections that the people were making with the animal. And that's what people seem to really what people seemed to really latch onto, was that the animal was this force in this guy's life, and now he was having to kind of part from it. People want stories. People want something. I mean, at least people who read the newspaper want a story, and so this was a story.
Yeah, I mean, a very, unflattering way to say it is that we have tended to use animals to flatter ourselves about what great animal lovers we are, how caring we are, how sentimental we are. So therefore it becomes hard to let go of that insistence on emotional connection and just look at the animal's behavior. But I'd love to get back to Karen's response to the question about what happens to language for a writer when you begin to take the animal's experience serious.
Well, my book is in many ways all about language, because the central story being told is about the experiments in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s in which chimpanzees were home raised in order to see what sort of language capabilities they might have if they were brought up in a human environment. So, there are, I have a lot of thoughts about that, a lot of responses to it, about 350 some pages worth of thoughts about that. But one of them is that we, as we flatter ourselves with our written language, which is something that these experiments were looking at, well, I guess not the written language, but our language capabilities, that we often forget how imperfect a vehicle it is in order to communicate. And so it seems to me that a lot of the scientists in these experiments were very, very slow to finally ask themselves, if we're really interested in the ways chimps communicate, maybe it makes more sense to look at how they communicate with each other and not demand that they communicate with us in our language. And some of the experiments in which chimps appear to impart information one to another, they do in ways that are invisible to us. So the information was clearly imparted, but the moment or the method is something that we don't see, and cannot know if there's also slippage in their communication. If they, we talk about the difficulty of understanding the inside mind of another creature, but of course we don't understand the inside mind of the people we're married to either, and so it shouldn't surprise us that we're only going to get so far when it's crows instead of husbands.
Karen, on the other hand, the plot of your novel posits the possibility of, at least for a certain age group of human, a genuine connection and intimate knowledge of the other species way of being.
Well, this is part of the tricky part, because yes, it possibly posits that, and it possibly posits the ability of the human to imagine a deep connection and a deep understanding. And I do think, I guess I want to say that, again, I was raised in a family where anthropomorphism was but I do think that our unwillingness to do that has been a different sort of barrier and boundary, and that if we refuse to accept emotions that appear to be like our emotions as like our emotions, because it puts the entire burden on the animal to prove to us something that can't be proven. And we live in a Darwinian world. We have more in common with the other creatures on this planet than we sometimes care to notice. And sometimes I think that science has been so cautious that it has forced us not to see things that are right in front of our faces.
Maybe just kind of piggyback. Oh, yes, I'm speaking to the microphone. Maybe to piggyback, and I shouldn't even use that phrase, a little bit on some of these comments about we're in a Darwinian moment and we're more similar than we think we are. I just was noticing, as we were talking about the question of writing being human, that in fact everyone talked about an animal that was kind of tracking itself, tracing itself, so the dog, the rat, the cat, and this is not my idea, right? There are people who have argued that really tracing and tracking is sort of the most fundamental form of language or writing. And so I guess I was just wondering if we posit that idea that animals who track and cover up their tracks and trace themselves are actually writing in some way, might it shift the answer a little bit? I mean, I guess I was thinking of you trying to track the cat, who was busy tracking his own sort of story, in a sense. I don't know, I was just really struck by, again, as Karen was saying, the way that we're so intent upon separating what human writing is from animal writing, for example.
Question here, JJ.
So this might be too anthropomorphic, but it's a question relative to yours about the politics of writing about animals. Is it more difficult to write about the animals or about animal activists? Karen, I'm thinking about ALF playing a role in your story and maybe some of the comments that you get on the Pet Room or other stories, which are more politically charged or more of a minefield territory.
I do think, you know, in the way that I referenced earlier with regard to the brown dog riots, that animal activists have had a bad rep in a number of ways for a number of years. They've, you know, been seen as sentimental. They've also been seen as extremists. They've been seen as putting human concerns in a sort of secondary role to other animal concerns. I guess, you know, I'm aware when I come into the book of that backdrop, and I'm, you know, I'm trying to be fair. I am extremely sympathetic to the animal rights movement and the animal liberation movement.
Were your editors at all concerned, for instance?
No, I don't think so. They were a little concerned that, you know, the FBI might notice the sites that I was on a lot and come knocking at my door. You know, it still startles me that people who take pictures in the factory farms are considered terrorists in the same way that people who take guns into public spaces and fire them are considered terrorists. Those just don't seem comparable acts to me in any way. So I'm doing a terrible job answering your question. I'm really just saying, yes, this is all very political, isn't it?
Well, I guess another political level of this is more kind of cultural politics. We're talking about animals that are in some ways close to us. Obviously pets, but also chimpanzees. In some sense, we've now just got so much more awareness and information about them. But there are other categories of animals, the food animals, so-called food animals, and we're aware of how fraught that is, especially around activism. But then there's also wild animals, and I'm wondering, how you think about that divide, the animals we watch TV with versus the animals we watch TV about. The ones.
I just did an introduction to a reissue of Vicki Hearn's Adam's Task, and one of the things that struck me about that book is that she puts the divide between us and them right there. Between she says the us includes all of the domesticated animals, and them is really only the wild animals, and that's been an interesting thing to think about.
Although in the case of chimpanzees and
well, they are both. They can, the ones I was looking at, again, were raised in human homes, but yes, of course,
to disastrous effect.
To disastrous effect.
When you were talking about rats and the sort of way that people think about them simultaneously, or it's more like either or, either they're pets or they're pests. There was one story where there was a rat who ended up being on Broadway, but the story begins where she's just one of a bunch of rats that's just dumped on the West Side Highway, and the city comes by and poisons them because they're a public health nuisance, and while the city is poisoning them, there are the rat rescue people and the rat activists who are kind of, pulling them out of their holes and safeguarding them, and there are some animals that sort of really are on that line between, things you would watch TV with and things you would watch on TV, and it's a tricky field.
And some that you don't want to think about, those are the pests. They're not on TV and you don't watch TV with them. Well, they may be watching TV with you, but you don't know. Right, yes. You had a question.
Kind of just addressed it. I was going to say there's a third category of what most people consider repulsive. I mean, like roaches and water bugs, subway rats.
There was a guy I wrote about who was an entomologist or a grad student in entomology, and he would kind of do shows where he would go around to various nightclubs or whatever with his collection of giant cockroaches and the African millipede that was this long. And he had an explicit program, which is that he wanted to, by normalizing these really gross animals, he thought he could get people to kind of change their minds generally about other human beings and combat xenophobia by forcing people to acknowledge the existence and the kind of not necessarily terribleness of these things they would normally think of as pests or worse.
There are actually a number of artists who work with insects, including cockroaches. Catherine Chalmers, who does video work, close-up video of cockroach stories, and it's very much with that intention of de-demonizing them.
There was a filmmaker, and a silent Arab filmmaker. What were the movies that actually had dressed up insects in them in the 19-teens? Do you know what I'm talking about? I don't remember that.
I think
well, speaking of, sorry, I was just going to go on about cockroaches.
So was I.
And recommend a book that we read in of my graduate class called Cockroach with a K by Tyler Knox. When you know, that's a novel about a cockroach who wakes up one morning and realizes he's a man. He's a man in Times Square in the 50s. But of course that brings up Kafka, which was something I wanted to bring up. When you talk about animals and writing, Kafka is never very far away. And you in particular, Karen, in the novel, use sections from Report to the Academy as epigraphs to, I think, many sections.
Every section.
Every section, yes. And the Report to the Academy, I think, in some ways that text stands as a answer to all the questions we've been asking.
I know, really, in many ways, nothing more needed to be written once that was done.
Yes, and yet, on the other hand, it is a very hard text to come to terms with and to explain and teach, and it does so much to destabilize that division between humans and animals. I mean, it just refuses that. It keeps on putting those two categories into a kind of dialectical spin, so that at some point you cannot think animals separate from humans and humans separate from animals.
I was going to say something too about the sort of the moment that we're in with regard to animals, and this is just very anecdotal, and I'm happy to hear that I've made it up rather than observed it. But I, recently we saw the third or fourth or whatever it is, Planet of the Apes movie, which I should tell you that my father-in-law was the film editor on the first one, so we have a particular interest in how this franchise is playing out. And I just saw Blade Runner 2049, and it seems to me, in a way that was not the case when I was growing up, that the humans are always the bad guys now. That we go into these movie theaters and find ourselves rooting for the non-humans. And that strikes me as interesting. And also, one of the painful parts about writing animals now is the extinction rate, and it seems like we've just gotten interested at the same time that we're destroying them, which is certainly unfortunate all around. But there was more about cockroaches, I thought. Are you satisfied?
Sorry. I don't remember where I read this, but the question, ask yourself, if you were in an isolation cell with no contact with any other creatures, whether it was a water bug or a roach, would you form a relationship or make a pet of a water bug or a roach?
Well, so much more potential there than a flattened volleyball or basketball or whatever it was, yes. The question was if you were in a situation where your only companion was some sort of roach or water bug, would you develop a relationship with that creature? And I suspect at least that I would.
So I'll ask my question. In the novel The White Bone, Barbara Gowdy imagines the lives and psychological states of elephants under attack from humans. What, as writers, do you think about such an endeavour in fiction, and what caveats and or suggestions would you have for somebody trying something similar?
Well, I find it very fraught. I just think it's a very tricky business to novelistically try to tell the story of an animal's experience, simply because I think even the form of the story is going to be defined by what the human readership will find to be a suitable story, even, right? Which has to have some kind of arc. So I find it hard, which isn't to say I don't try to do that at all. So I should defer.
Well, I don't try to do that either.
To people who at least write fiction, right? And I do not. But I think that trying to imagine outside of a human, and trying to get away from it being in any way a human inside the elephant's skin, right, would be the only way to do it. And temporally, the world might be disjoint for a human readership, and sensorially, the world would certainly be unrecognizable. And the more that one could get into that space, the better a job I think one would do.
Interestingly, there aren't a great many novels for adults that try to do that. It's obviously a very favorite genre of children's fiction, fables and animal stories, but not of. The White Bone is kind of unusual in that regard, and I think it's very successful. But it's a really hard thing to pull off. And I think most novelists don't. We'll look for another way in, including the kinds of things that we've been hearing about here, which is really talking about the interspecies dimension, the human relationship to the animal, rather than trying to inhabit the animal subject.
Karen was saying about how children's literature is so full of animals as little people, and they're almost all little people. I mean, they really are wearing pants and having jobs, and I find that a fascinating introduction that we're giving. Maybe if the level of change of perspective is simmering up, I would love it to be simmering up more in the children's literature first, so that the child's mind, which is open to the realization that the human is an animal, isn't just closed and starts defining animals as only of interest if they represent people.
Yeah. Well, in children's novels, children's literature, it's much more anthropomorphic than zoomorphic. When children aren't encouraged to think of themselves as animals, they're encouraged to think about animals as humans.
It seems like it's like the first step. Like maybe there's a perception that kids aren't ready to, or somehow can't get as interested in reading about an adult doing something, and so here's something. It's not quite a kid, but it's a dog who's a mom, or whatever it is. It's a like almost a softer way to introduce them to something that gets a lot more.
Well, I think I have a very dim view of the animal discourse in childhood culture, and I think things like the stories, but also the practice of taking your kids to the zoo. I think those are all practices by which we exert our dominance and teach that view of the world, teach a kind of anthropocentric and human dominant attitude towards other animals.
I think that's something that's changing. Also, my daughter, who's now 12, once she was about 8 or 9, she just refused to go to the zoo anymore because she saw it exactly that way.
I would just say that I think the lack of animal characters in adult books is a great shame. And I wish there was a great deal more of it. And, if it's a novel, then I think we all understand that the writer is using their imagination to do something that won't stand up in court, but hopefully has some other value. I have no problem. I don't do it myself because I'm not brave enough, but somebody wrote, a Canadian writer, and I've reached that age where it's a beautiful, beautiful life or a beautiful something. Anyway, it came out about the same time as my book, in many ways a similar story about a human-raised chimp, but he had long sections from the point of view of the chimp, which did not seem right to me in my book, but which I had no objection to in his.
I also really do like that it's at least giving an animal the chance to have a narrative, right? The animal has a story, just as one needs to, or it's useful to name endangered animals in order to get people to want to fund them, name them and give them a little history as we recognize. And I kind of do like that. That sort of anthropomorphism is just saying, which could be the truth as well. And anthropomorphism doesn't have to be wrong. Just projecting so that we start to see at all, right? And I'm fascinated by Andy's kind of immersive journalism, the fact that it changed probably a long-held view of pigeons into individuals, right? To me, that's the terrific transition. That's terrific. I think of science as a way to do that. But maybe fiction can be as well, just in the fact of treating the animal to a story.
Yeah,
also, so hard, but it can be done, as we said with Kafka. Virginia Woolf's biography of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's dog Flush. That's a wonderful example of a kind of mindful anthropomorphism.
Watership Down is a very good example.
I love Watership Down. There was a time in my life when I could speak rabbit, having just read that book, but it's fallen into disuse. I can no longer bring it to mind.
My daughter is now fluent. I had this T-shirt that I made when I was a little kid, and I first read Watership Down. It says "Sofle Haraka" on it, which is rabbit talk for eat shit. And I somehow held on to it into adulthood, and I gave it to my daughter, and she reads it all the time. So that's a kind of language that I guess animals can be credited with, but of course it's totally invented by a guy.
I also think, you talked about the creation of personas. Wow, sorry, I don't know how I keep doing that. For the Instagram market. But, one of the things that I feel that we have noticed in the last few years is that you can't just, do an experiment with one chimpanzee and think this is how chimpanzees are, that they do have personalities and they do have different capabilities. And I suspect that Washoe, the first signing chimp, was actually kind of a genius, because the number of signs she was able to learn really significantly outstripped most of the others who were taught the signing vocabulary. I think there are chimps now who use, who manipulate computer symbols, and that they too can have quite large vocabularies. But my daughter studied sea lions, and she studied the development of diving behavior in a particular group of sea lions in Australia, the Australian sea lion. And she worked at the UC Santa Cruz lab, which studies marine mammals, as one of the centers in the country for the study of marine mammals. And what they have discovered is that, just because sea lions do something in a certain way off the coast of Kangaroo Island does not mean that very, very similar animals up in Alaska won't do it very, very differently. That that, one of the problems with the large charismatic animal research is that you're usually dealing with such a small sample size, and that the things that you find, it turns out, have a more limited usefulness than we once thought.
Dave over here.
So, this is just a comment that I think sort of chimes with what people were saying in response to the last question, but in a somewhat different language. This term anthropomorphism is a very clumsy term, and to think, and we tend to treat something as sort of a binary, like there's complete transparency on the one side and anthropomorphism on the other side. And there's certainly sort of going views in philosophy of mind and psychology that think of ourselves as being self-interpreting constantly. I mean, it's if you want to use the term anthropomorphizing, I'm constantly anthropomorphizing myself. You're not getting a printout, an immediate presentation of what's going on in this scattered, fragmented thing we call my mind. And then when it comes to sort of dealing with other humans, we're constantly interpreting them in various ways to make them manageable, to make them interpretable, so we can figure out how to negotiate them, through the world, and so on. So I don't think we should feel so embarrassed about doing that with non-human animals, given that this project really starts at home. And in fact, the clumsiest, most embarrassing, sort of worst thing is when people actually somehow try to mimic what they think of as a very distant voice of the other. And the same thing comes up, when writers sort of try to speak dialect, from another culture of which they're not a part. So personally, I often find the worst thing to do is to try to capture some sense of radical otherness in the other, as opposed to some, sort of more avowedly sort of interpretivist kind of stance.
Hi, my question would be, do you believe that animals are kind of aware of their sense of purpose, if you think that anyone has any sense of purpose, or do you believe that they're driven by primal urges or their surroundings more?
Well, it's an interesting question, and it is one that sort of, in some other forms, some scientists ask about animals. Animal scientists ask sort of a question of whether they have non-human animals reflect upon themselves, right? And sort of maybe imagine their autobiography and sort of think about where they've been and where they might be. And that's something that sort of as a conservative scientist, or I mean conservative in the way that I'm hesitant to sort of say I know, I would say we're agnostic about a lot of that, but that doesn't mean that therefore that the other possibility is that there's something just instinctive. This sort of binary between instinctive or thoughtful has long been overthrown as sort of unuseful, and again, this very much a remnant of this considering a human outside of the animal as the pinnacle of animal species, or as outside of, sort of removed from natural selection at some point, and therefore not animal-like, without instincts, and that's been very muddied. So it isn't just a binary. Now, if you're saying, well, do animals think about what they're there for and about? I don't know. I think language enables us to do a lot of talking about that type of thing for ourselves that maybe non-linguistic animals don't do, but I'm not sure that we even really have a sense of our purpose, right? Like I think we could pretend that we do, but I mean, most of us, I think, can talk about purpose and yet are just stumbling along, dealing with our primal, impulses and urges as they throw us hither and yon. So my answer is I don't know.
Father the Skinnerian had said about that.
My father, the Skinnerian, would have said, that we can't know about the other animals, but that we should be very cautious, as Alexandra has suggested, in believing that we are creatures of reason. As careful as he was with non-human animals and whether they could think or not, he was really unimpressed with human thinking as well.
I would just say one other thing, though, in response to your question. It's interesting that when you asked that question, we also assumed that Alexandra would field it. And it is framed as a kind of question that a scientist should take up, and which then circumscribes whatever answer you're going to get within the history of scientific investigations of the non-human animals, including what Dale was talking about, the suspicion about anthropomorphism. But it's a question that, the question you asked is a question we could all ask ourselves and try to answer based on our own experience of non-human animals, including our pets. Most pet owners would say, yes, absolutely, my animals do have some sense of purpose based on my observations. And that could be dismissed as anthropomorphism, but I completely agree with Dale that is just a kind of, I think, commonsensical way of operating in the world, is understanding things based on one's own, sense of how things are, and trusting that a little bit, rather than, I feel we've been put into a kind of position that we're supposed to not speculate, not emotionally extend ourselves towards the other animals, because it has for so long been the purview of science. It's as if ordinary people should, just assume that they're ignorant about this matter. Whereas, it's a continuum. There are so many ways of conducting these investigations. So for me, it's opening it up to the sense that, maybe the imagination is one of the most powerful ways for us to engage the question of the purposiveness of other animals.
Scientists have imagination.
Sure. Well, sure, of course.
I want to say on that point, I think that Dale and I disagree a little bit, and I don't think it's because I'm a scientist, because it's just one of the hats I have, right? And it isn't a hat that I've worn all my life. And it's one that I just put on now and then. And most of my writing about dogs is not actually with the scientist hat on. But I do think that the reason I spend time thinking about anthropomorphisms, I see the science perspective on it, and I see my own inclinations as a person who deals with animals. But my only caution about it is that I view that I could say, instead of using that word, I could say preemptive storytelling, presumptive storytelling. I feel like that's something that happens a lot, and although we can speculate and imagine, often we don't. And science gives one way to approach it, and I like the ways that we don't have answers in science as much as the ways that we do. But I think that often we have an inclination, and I'm trying not to say this as a scientist, but that we, scientists included, have an inclination to speculate just into something that looks just like us, but's furrier. And as opposed to really imaginatively engaging the other. And that's what I think, that's what I resist, or what I call anthropomorphism.
Hello, thank you. I was wondering how you manage difficult material. Like how you, if you encounter, especially Andy, like really difficult stories, like the animals being neglected or tortured, or like dog experiments, the canine experiments of the past, or of course the chimps. Like how you process confronting it and dealing with it, and sort of moving on from that experience, and also how you choose what to write and not write, like what to represent and circulate in the world.
as a reporter generally, and not just writing about animals, but writing about anything that's difficult to, you know, that is emotionally difficult to deal with, I've always found that the only thing that really works is to just kind of open yourself up to it and let yourself feel it, so that you're not kind of like drawing a wall between you and what you're doing, which all reporters kind of instinctively do anyway, because we're constantly sort of like stepping back and being the observer. But if you want to really be able to convey some semblance of what's really going on, you just have to kind of let yourself feel these things. So there, you know, I haven't really written about kind of large-scale cruelties or like the abuses of factory farming and stuff like that. I don't know how I would be writing about that, because that's something that really gets me very, very angry. And I think I would have a hard time maintaining what passes for journalistic objectivity. But just with these pet stories that I was writing, several of them, you know, the subjects died while I was writing the story. Or like this rat that went on Broadway, she then like 3 days later fell, and then I had to write a story about the rat who everybody had just gotten to know, you know, reading the story, and then it died. And I felt really sad, you know, writing the story. I felt really, I was sad that the rat who I kind of made friends with had died. But once you kind of let yourself feel it, then that's kind of part of like almost digesting the content emotionally, and then you can kind of write a story that incorporates your emotions without actually, you know, letting that kind of dominate what's going on. I don't know if that answered your question at all.
Just sort of going off of that question and drawing the line between being emotionally exploitative and opening up and giving a story about an animal, at what point can we get people to care about what's happening to animals without talking about horrific details of what's happened to them? And can we sort of, I don't know, I'm just curious, is there a way to depict animals and to get people to care about animals and wonder about animals without going into such graphic detail and making people so upset? And
when you say care about animals, and then take action X, or care about like,
I guess in the same way that we all are here because we're interested in discussing animals, or not necessarily taking action, but wanting to learn more about them. It could also mean taking action or caring about their suffering. I'm just sort of curious whether we need to, whether it's necessary to talk about horrific details of things that are happening to animals.
I mean, I think people are interested and care about animals in any kind of, you know, in any of these sort of types of narratives. It doesn't have to be just something horrific to get people to, I mean, people like the story about the cat who just kind of walks up and down the street and, you know, does cat things.
Yeah, taking the animals seriously as a subject, you know, as Una said, that's, I think that is the way in, and then the facts in the context of their subjecthood can be plainly spoken, as opposed to that being the thing that's supposed to get people interested, the horrific fact. The interest is in the individual or the species or the population, or the community, and if that's elaborated, then I think that's how we take them seriously.
By in fact making them as interesting as they are, by showing how interesting they are rather than just how victimized they are, you know, which is something that your kind of writing does. But also, I think another way that happens is with an example like Karen's novel, accounts of really deep and complex relationships between humans particularly like individual humans and other individual animals. And the story of that, that's what Kafka was so brilliant at. And that's what's so beautiful in your novel, is we don't hear from Fern, but we hear about Rosemary's attachment to her, which is so profound as we begin to care about Fern as much as Rosemary does. And it becomes a very credible space of interspecies concern. So, I think that's the other way to do it, is just show how much humans get from being connected to animals.
But I would also like to say, first of all, that as a reader, there is a limit to how much I am willing to suffer reading a fiction book. A different standard where nonfiction is concerned, but if somebody's making up a story, then I do have a limit. And so I think about that a lot. When I wrote We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves, I knew I was going to be presenting some really horrific material, which I did not make up. But the way I tried to deal with it in the book is by being very, very funny. So that I know I'm going to ask you to look at things you would rather not look at, but I'm also going to be very funny, which is generally my response to being angry, is to be funny as my coping mechanism. But I also feel, I grew up during the Vietnam War, and my husband and I just watched the Ken Burns 13-hour recap, and was remembering how present that war was to us in terms of what we saw on the television. There was a body count every night on television of how many of the enemy we had killed, and how many of our brave boys had died. And I think, what was learned by our government from that exercise is that people don't want to fight a war if they actually see what is involved. And therefore, in order to continue to fight wars, we're just not going to show you that anymore. And that this strategy of removing from our sight line things that we would not tolerate if we actually looked at them, like the factory farms. There are a number of proposals, and I'm not sure at this point if any of them has actually been passed or not, but I think that in a few states it has been made illegal to take pictures of the factory farms and actually show you what is going on. Our prison system, exactly the same thing, completely removed from us so that we can continue our lives without thinking about it. And I guess, if I have a core morality, this is it. I think if we cannot bear to look at things, then we shouldn't be doing them. And the idea of not looking at them is troubling to me, because it allows them to continue unopposed, not a ripple in our lives.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think of a novel like Ruth Ozeki's My Year of Meats, where she was very courageous about exposing that. But I guess I just want to circle back to what you said about your sense of limits with fiction. It seems like you were saying, in fact, that fiction should not take on the burden of that kind of exposure.
No, I'm just talking again about my reading experience, that I don't want to be made miserable by a story someone has just made up. But I am willing to be made miserable
by the truth.
By the truth, yes. And often am made miserable by the truth.
I think we have time for just one more question. We haven't let Nandini.
Okay. So, can everybody hear me? No? Now? So, I'm really interested in how, when we tend to think about animals, we tend to think about how we act upon them. how our lives kind of change theirs, how we shape and control what they can or can't do, and how we do or do not know them. But something that I found really fascinating about the novel is that you're kind of taking on the ways in which being close to animals changes us as well. And I kind of envision, and I can see it kind of coming out of your talks, writing as a way of being close to animals. And I'm just kind of wondering if you can speak a little bit about how writing has changed the way that you think about yourself, or the way that you think about your work, or the way that you kind of encounter animals in your everyday lives. You can pick one of those things.
Well, I became a vegetarian writing the book. That's the clearest answer I have to that question. I think that I share with many, many writers the sense that I don't, in fact, know what I think about anything until I try to write about it. And then, one of the things that I try to do as a general rule when I'm writing any kind of novel that has some sort of agenda, which I feel all novels do, whether noticed or not, is that I want to be fair to the people who don't think the way I do. I spend a lot of time trying to create the best possible case I can against whatever I am trying to argue, so that when I have an argument, I have it not with some sort of easily demolished straw man that I've created, but with somebody who has actually concocted a reasonable case that I then have to deal with.
For my last book, I wound up not just writing about the science of the sensory world of dogs, but also trying to become a better smeller myself, and going through the process of training in olfaction, and going and sniffing buildings and objects, and following what my dogs were sniffing. And that was a profound change, and that was because of that process, the changes that I have a superpower. I can, and so do all of you. You can smell things and we're not. And looking at the animals let me see an impairment in our civilization at some level, this sensory limitation, circumscription, that I'm really happy to bust through all the time. And so I'm infinitely happy about that.
I think writing about my dog, Barnaby, and also taking pictures of him, it's probably changed me only in small ways, but I think I've learned something about patience and acceptance from that when I go and walk him, instead of kind of like, pulling him from one place to another. I'm going to let him go at his own pace, and he's going to just show me what it is that he wants, because that's the way that I'm going to kind of understand more about what he's doing. And even things like, going to the bathroom on the floor, which I still find a little bit aggravating. It just feels like, okay, he's doing that, he must have a reason for doing that. It just kind of made me slow down a little bit and kind of be a little bit more thoughtful, and obviously that kind of bleeds over into other things in our lives.
I would like to say just one more thing about that, which is that when you start looking at human behavior through the lens of primatology, as I did for this book, it is very hard to stop. And that is certainly the lens that I brought to the 2016 election. That there's just, that you start noticing a lot of posturing and chest beating, and the power of posturing and chest beating. And it's all very, very, very upsetting when it goes as terribly wrong as it did.
Yeah, but that notwithstanding, I think that in some ways trying to imagine the perspective of non-human others has made me much more charitable to other people. and the limits of my knowledge about other people, because I've dropped a lot of the presumption about another person's experience and approach and life and mind. And that's helped me. And I also see the humor in that presumption. And so I've stepped back a little bit from other humans as well.
You're a lovely person. It's just made me, it's just made me crabby.
Can I just say it would be nicer if these apes didn't have nuclear weapons?
Yes.
That's all. I can't think of a more complex place to conclude this conversation. Would you all please join me first in thanking our panel?